Well, good afternoon or good morning, shall I say. I am so glad you have joined me this morning. And just to do some little housekeeping, we're going to start off reminding everyone that next week is the end of the semester, hopefully. And I need all of your PowerPoint presentations to be uploaded. For those who have not completed your work in this class, you need to do it so I can give you a grade. Now, I don't want anyone to fail this class. You know, I don't believe in failure. But it's up to you if you want to fail. I do not have a problem with you getting an F if that's what you want. But I don't like giving Fs. But you can have one if you want it. So, to keep that from happening, complete the rest of your work. I've sent you some emails telling you what PowerPoint presentations that need to be completed and uploaded in coursework. If you have a problem with doing this, I'm going to give you my phone number again. I've already given it to you. And my number is area code 318-470-2608. Be sure and mention who you are and what class you are talking about that I can assist you with, and I will make sure that you get everything in that you need. I want everyone to get at least a B. Be sure and put your references and put your title page. Be creative and do me some color schemes. That would be very nice. So, with all of that being said, we are going to begin with the review. Today, we are going to start reviewing for what we have done already to be sure that you know what you have to do and what you have learned out of this class. So we're going to go back and begin with the PowerPoint presentation from chapter 1. Okay, this is a review. Thank you so very much. And we're going to start this show at this time. And what we're going to discuss is chapter 1, Joining a Tradition of Social Reform. So the objectives of policy advocacy: seek changes to policies to improve the well-being of members of vulnerable populations and outgroups. Thank you, Ms. Carr, for coming and visiting with me and seeing how my class is going. And of course, you know you're on camera and you're being seen. So this is Ms. Carr from the education department. She does an 8 o'clock class in physiology. And she's about to leave because her class has ended and mine is beginning. So, let us continue. Number 2, seek policy reforms that are in general interest. So that's the objectives of policy advocacy. Also, number 3, it worked from an ecological or systems perspective. Change many kinds of policies, including informal ones. Prioritize policy changes that assist oppressed populations. It encounter and surmount barriers to reform. Policy advocacy joined a tradition of social reform in American society and in the social work profession. It develops attributes that support policy advocacy. Try to change the composition of government by participating in what? Electoral politics. So, diversity in policy advocacy. Social workers need to have an awareness of how people in diverse groups have experienced discrimination and prejudice, and how they have been oppressed or not adequately protected by existing policy. Diversity needs to be considered at more than just the cultural level. Outgroups are defined as vulnerable populations who have experienced discrimination and prejudice over an extended period of time. Other outgroups. Here are some. Racial groups, persons who have been subjected to overt or covert discrimination stemming from racism in existing policy structures such as housing, education, and criminal justice. Sociological groups, persons who have been subjected to discrimination stemming from assumed dependency, such as women, people with disabilities, etc., who are often denied access to certain types of jobs and roles in decision making. Then we have dependent groups, persons, typically children, who must rely on society for basic amenities, but who have little or no political clout. Other outgroups are they call nonconformist groups, persons who are subjected to discrimination because they are viewed as violating sexual norms, such as gay men and lesbians, social norms, criminal offenders, other expectations, persons with mental illnesses. Model groups, persons who are denied social support and resources because of the assumption that their group has no social problems, such as Jewish Americans, Asian Americans, and some white ethnic Americans. Economic groups, persons in low and moderate income groups who lack sufficient resources or stable employment, which preludes participation in other social and political structures. Compensatory strategies for outgroups. Long-standing structural discrimination has occurred toward many outgroups. Policy advocates are not always content with simply equalizing policies for members of outgroups with the dominant population. Often they advocate for compensatory strategies, such as extra services or supports that will assist members of vulnerable populations with achieving partiality. Something to consider. When engaging in policy advocacy with certain vulnerable populations, be cautious when identifying factors that lead them to lag behind the dominant population. Do not stigmatize members of these groups. View them as dependent or rely on panaceas to quickly alter the effects of long-term systematic discrimination. Advancing the public interest at home. Policy advocates tackle problems of citizens in general, such as child care, that improve the developmental and cognitive well-being of all children. Preventive services that diminish the incidence of major social problems that afflict citizens, whether or not they are members of a vulnerable population. Example, health risk notifications on tobacco products, better public transportation, living wage policies for all workers. Advancing the public interest abroad. Policy advocates also tackle problems of international concerns, such as international standards that govern wages and pollution, protecting wages of American workers who compete with cheaper labor abroad, when immigrants should receive citizenship and how immigrant rights should be protected in the United States, poverty and disease in developing nations. Using an ecological perspective, citizen lives are impacted by multiple factors, including economic, cultural, social, community, and physiological, as well as discrimination or prejudice. Existing policies are part of their ecology. They limit resources, services, and opportunities that vulnerable populations receive, but also they provide them. Advocates examine the problems and populations that will be impacted by policy proposals from an ecological perspective. Example, they ask what forces and factors in the lives of welfare recipients influence whether they can secure and retain employment. They seek policies that address these ecological factors. So what is social policy? Policy advocates aim to change social policies. Social policy is a collective strategy that prevents and addresses social problems. Again, social policy is a collective strategy that prevents and addresses social problems. It can be considered goal-driven problem solving. So, types of social policies. Number one, regulations. Example, minimum wage, housing codes, the FDA regulation. That's the Federal Drug Administration regulations. Then number two, the needs meeting policies. Example, meeting the needs, that's what we're talking about, the needs meeting policies. Example, food stamps, Medicaid and Medicare, and SSI, which is supplemental social income. Opportunity enhancing policies. Example, public education, job training. Social service policies, such as mental health, child welfare, substance abuse, etc. And substance abuse treatment. That's what the TX stands for. Referral and linkage policies. Referral and linkage policies. Case management, outreach, ombudsman, civil rights policy. Example, the Civil Rights Act, American with Disabilities Act. Equality policies, enhancing policies. Example, the Earned Income Tax Credit. Assessment accumulation policies. Example, legislation stimulating individual investment accounts. And infrastructure development policies such as parks, roads, bridges, public transportation. Economic development policies. Example, tax incentives and loans to businesses that locate themselves in low-income areas. Facilitating political participation policies. Example, campaign finance reform and the redistricting of areas for voting. Budget changing policies. Reallocate money to address specific policies. And also types of social policies such as protective policies, example, child welfare laws, restraining orders. And then we have the prevention policies. Example, screening detection for mental illness, day treatment activities for the elderly. So here are we going to talk about the targets of policy reform. Problems in the social service system that are the targets of policy reform in specific agencies, service networks, or legislation establishing new programs. So here are the targets: fragmentation, discontinuity, lack of access, discrimination, screaming, wastage, lack of outreach, incompetent staff, lack of cultural sensitivity, inadequate funding. So when is a policy a social policy? Public welfare, child welfare, medical and job training policies are clearly social policies. What about tax, environment, economic, transportation, and other policies? Specific policies become social policies whenever they influence social problems. So the answer to the question, when is a policy a social policy? It is whenever they influence social problems. Example, income tax proposals that increase or decrease the resources of poor persons to become social policies when they affect poverty and unemployment. So look at the ladder of social policy. There are different levels at which you can intervene in policy. Number one, individual private agencies, higher level agencies such as county offices, state legislative arenas, federal legislative arenas, and court rulings. The different forms of social policy. Number one, statutes. The legislation approved by governmental bodies. Policy objectives, mission statements, rules and regulations, administrative rules that direct or limit action. So there are three forms of social policy: statutes, policy objectives, and rules and regulations. There's also budgets, which determine what resources are devoted to services. And of course, we discussed this court ruling earlier, the judicial decisions that direct or limit action. So 4 categories of policy. Number one, official written policies, such as an agency's policies and procedures manual. Informal unwritten policies, such as the standard of practice in an agency, even though you won't find it in a book. Number 3, personal orientation toward policy, what an individual believes about a policy. And number 4, personal policy action. Example, actualized policy, what an individual enacts or ignores in relation to a specific policy. So let's look at policy practice as compared to policy advocacy. Policy practice includes efforts to change policies in legislative, agency, and community settings by establishing new policies, improving existing ones, and defeating the policy initiative of others. Example, people of all ideological persuasion engage in policy practice. Number 2, practice advocacy aims to help relatively powerless groups improve their resources and opportunities. And number 3, policy practice refers to efforts generally to change policies, and policy advocacy refers to efforts to help powerless groups improve their life. So look at the 8 tasks in policy practice. Number 1, deciding what is right and wrong. Number 2, navigating policy and advocacy systems. Number 3, agenda setting tasks. Number 4, problem analyzing tasks. Number 5, developing policy proposals. Number 6, policy enacting tasks. Number 7, policy implementation. And Number 8, policy assessment tasks. That's the evaluation part. Skills used in policy advocacy. Analytic skills, which obtains data, identify alternatives, compare relative merits, develop recommendations. And political skills, which assess the policy's feasibility, identify power resources, develop and implement political strategy. We also have interactional skills, make contacts, develop networks, build personal relationships, communicate effectively, facilitate coalitions and committees. Then we have value clarification skills, decide what objectives you favor when analyzing problems and developing proposals, determine what risks you will take in questioning existing policies. Challenges encountered by policy advocates. Number 1, a crowded field. Policies generally commit or bind large groups of persons and organizations to specific courses of action. Divergent interests. Example, since specific persons, interest groups, and corporations often benefit from specific policies, they often oppose changes in them or only want changes that advance their own needs. Let's look at divergent values and ideologies. Example, people often support or oppose policies because they believe they infringe on their fundamental values. Different beliefs about effectiveness of policy. Example, opposition from persons and groups who contend that their proposals will not work or are too expensive. So, joining the social work reform tradition. Number 1, the profession of social work has a strong tradition of social reform. Number 2, the combined effects of social reforms and have transformed the lives of tens of millions of Americans in positive ways. Policy advocates have been involved in efforts to what? Reform the institution of slavery and later the lynching of African Americans, imprisonment of indebtedness, and capital punishment for relatively minor crimes, 14-hour workdays, unsafe working conditions, and child labor, the routine firing of gay men and lesbians, widespread malnutrition, the denial of education, employment, and services to people with disabilities, poverty among older persons, health needs of certain groups such as persons with kidney failure, the preschool needs of low-income children, treatment of psychological conditions such as depression. These are things that the social workers do to advocate and help in efforts to reform these atrocities. Yet much remains to be done with respect to homelessness, huge economic inequalities, the uninsured and the underinsured, specific kinds of discrimination, eradication of diseases such as AIDS, poor education, underfunded services. Social work has had a social reform tradition extending back to the formation of social work profession. Founders of social work such as Jane Addams militantly supported an array of social reforms in the progressive era. In succeeding eras, many social workers joined this reform tradition by working for policy reforms in local, state, and federal jurisdictions. They argue that social inequality, blighted neighborhoods, inadequate resources, unemployment, environmental pollution, discrimination, and economic uncertainty cause human suffering and contribute to clinical conditions such as depression and poor health. But narrow perspectives such as social work coexist with the reformers' vision. Such persons believe the profession should focus on casework with scant involvement in social reform. These narrow perspectives are deficient on at least 3 grounds. By failing to address the societal factors that contribute to inequality, they neglect such values as social justice and fairness. Number 2, with attention exclusively on the problems of individuals, they do nothing to reform the human services system so that it provides services that are congruent with recent social science research. By abandoning the political arena, they allow other groups with values and perspectives in opposition to the needs of clients, consumers, and citizens to dominate social public policy. Devotion and policy advocacy. Many federal policies were devoted to state and local governments in the 1980s and 1990s. The federal government provides block grants to these states and allows them to decide how to use these resources with minimal federal guidelines. This devolution of authority has meant that many policies influencing the lives of clients, consumers, and citizens are shaped by state legislatures, county boards of supervisors, and municipal governments. One such example would be food stamps. Devolution has accentuated the need for policy reform and work by dispersing key decisions to smaller units of government and disseminating many policies that used to be decided at the national level. Technology and policy. A technological revolution that has transformed the American economy. Beginning in the 1960s, the automobile, steel, and other manufacturing industries relocated to other nations and were replaced by low-paying service industries. The wages of huge numbers of Americans plummeted. The economic and social well-being of tens of millions of Americans deteriorated in the wake. Policy advocacy is needed to help equalize conditions and opportunities. Globalization and policy advocacy. Policy advocacy must span international boundaries due to the accelerated movement of capital and labor between nations. The movement of jobs across national boundaries adversely impacted domestic workers and undermines their ability to get wage concessions from employers. Immigrants who now live in virtually every state are subject to considerable prejudice, poor working conditions, and low pay. Especially if they're coming across the border right now, they're even detaining them that they can't even get out of these, what they call holding tanks. Others consider them to be prisons and jails. And this is an ongoing battle at this time as I'm speaking. Hopefully, the social workers will get involved and other advocates to help resolve this issue. Global warming could endanger vast numbers of persons in coastal areas in the United States and elsewhere. So the qualities of effective policy advocates. This is the qualities. Policy advocates have a vision. They seek opportunities for advocacy. They take sensible risks. They balance flexibility with planning. They are appropriately assertive. They develop multi-skill sets. They are persistent, tolerant, uncertainty. They tolerate uncertainty. They balance pragmatism with principles. They are leaders. Two things to remember in getting started. Policy advocates seldom act alone. They usually work in tandem with existing advocacy groups or with other persons who have experience in policy advocacy. Many social work students have actually made a strong beginning, even during their professional training, in critically analyzing existing policies and seeking changes in them. Thank you so very much. That is the end of Chapter 1 review, and we will continue with Chapter 2 review on tomorrow, which is the 21st. And we're doing these reviews to make sure you understand and get the knowledge that you need to begin becoming a policy advocate and understanding social work, legislation, and policy. Thank you so very much. Again, I am Dr. McDonald. If you have questions, you may email me. As I've always said, you may email me at rmcdonald@texascollege.edu. Again, rmcdonald@texascollege.edu. Identify who you are and what course you are talking about. Do the same if you decide to text me. My number is area code 318-470-2608. That is Dr. McDonald. I'm an associate professor of social work at Texas College. Please feel free to contact me. I am here to help you. As we say, I am a social worker by profession, and I do my best to help all the students. So let's get started and become advocates for those who cannot advocate for themselves. Thank you so very much. God bless. Have a good day.